300 souls. 6 minutes. That is all it took for the SS Atlantic, the jewel of the Great Lakes, to transform from a marvel of modern speed into a watery grave. As the ship groaned and surrendered to the abyss, those opulent staterooms instantly morphed into a labyrinth of sheer panic. For hundreds of immigrants seeking a new life, the gap between their American dream and a frigid death vanished in a single, gut-wrenching heartbeat. But what truly dragged this masterpiece of engineering to the bottom of Lake Erie? While official reports dismissed it as a tragic accident, chilling rumors of what really lurked beneath the surface have haunted these waters for over a century. Was this catastrophe an unavoidable clash of fate, or was it the inevitable price of a brutal industry war, where other priorities far outweighed the value of human life? The truth remains entombed within the wreckage. Stay with me until the very end, as we pierce through the fog of history to finally expose the dark, hidden forces that sealed the fate of the Atlantic. In 1848, in the quiet shipbuilding town of Newport, Michigan, now known as Marine City master shipbuilder J.L. Wolverton, launched a vessel that would become a legend of luxury. She was the SS Atlantic, a steamer that represented the absolute pinnacle of mid-century maritime engineering. Stretching 267 feet in length with a beam of 33 feet and a depth of 12.5 feet, she boasted a tonnage of 1,155 tons, a true behemoth for her time. Owned by the visionary E.B. Ward of Detroit and operated by the Michigan Central Railroad, the Atlantic was designed for one primary, unyielding purpose: commercial dominance. She was the crown jewel of the Michigan Central Fleet, a floating palace intended to bridge the economic gap between the bustling ports of Buffalo, New York, and Detroit, Michigan. With 85 opulent staterooms and a theoretical capacity of over 300 passengers, she featured polished mahogany fixtures, elegant dining halls, and all the refined accoutrements of Gilded Age luxury. Yet, her most intoxicating and dangerous trait was her blistering speed. In an era where transportation was the singular lifeblood of commerce, the Atlantic shattered all existing records, famously clocking in at an incredible 16.5 hours for the run between Buffalo and Detroit. By the early 1850s, the Great Lakes had become the stage for a desperate, high-stakes duel between competing steamboat lines and the burgeoning, aggressive railroad industry. The goal was ruthlessly simple: capture the passengers, move them faster than any competitor, and monopolize the market. Safety, quite often, was a secondary or even tertiary consideration to the strict dictates of the schedule. Boilers were pushed to their absolute limits, often operating at pressures that would terrify modern engineers, and captains were under intense, unrelenting pressure to prioritize speed above all else. The Atlantic became the ultimate, shining symbol of this industrial hubris, a vessel so technologically advanced and visually imposing that her owners and crews began to operate under the delusion that she was invincible. The heartbeat of the Atlantic wasn't just the rhythmic thumping of her massive engines. It was the thousands of souls who filled her decks, seeking a future that their homelands could no longer provide. Among them were the desperate, the hopeful, and the profoundly displaced individuals like Amund Eadsmo and the hundreds of Norwegian immigrants aboard. Their journey to the American Midwest was a nightmare of endurance. Having departed from Christiania, modern-day Oslo, in early 1852, they had already survived the horrors of a transatlantic crossing, enduring weeks of heaving waves, claustrophobic and disease-ridden quarters, and the constant, gnawing threat of starvation. They arrived at Quebec on the 12th of August, 1852, only to be immediately thrust into a grueling, multimodal, continental transit. From Quebec to Montreal, then by rail to Toronto, and finally, after a torturous journey through locks and wagons, they arrived in Buffalo, New York, with their spirits battered but their hopes intact. These were not leisure travelers. They were venerable newcomers. Many were fleeing deep-seated poverty, famine, or religious persecution, carrying their entire worldly existence in humble wooden chests and cloth bundles. In Buffalo, they boarded the Atlantic with a mixture of profound, soul-deep exhaustion and a fragile, budding hope for a new life in the fertile lands of Wisconsin. By the time the Atlantic departed Buffalo on the evening of the 19th of August, 1852, she was a vessel under siege not by a foreign army, but by a massive, unmanaged surge of humanity. Captain J. Byron Petty, a man operating under the immense, crushing pressure to maintain the company's ruthless, high-speed schedule, commanded a ship that was dangerously, criminally overcrowded. While her design capacity was roughly 300 passengers, historical estimates suggest that between 500 and 600 people were crammed aboard that night. The ship's clerk did not keep an accurate, professional tally. Every single cabin was packed to the gills with families. The decks were a nightmare of logistical chaos, piled precariously high with immigrants' heavy baggage, massive new wagons, and bulky farm equipment. There was no room left for the human cargo to move, let alone breathe. Families like Almond Eidsmoes, who had spent their last meager savings on passage, had to prepare their beds right on the exposed deck, nestled between crates and tools. As the Atlantic left Erie, Pennsylvania, at 11 p.m., the lake was deceptively, hauntingly calm. A light, suffocating mist hung over the water, softening the horizon into a blur. The stage was set for a tragedy of epic proportions. At 2 a.m. on the 20th of August, 1852, the SS Atlantic surged through the darkness, carrying a precious, fragile cargo of over 500 souls toward the promise of an American future. On the bridge, the silence of the night served as a haunting prelude to the most harrowing and senseless maritime disaster the Great Lakes had ever witnessed. This was no longer a routine commercial voyage. It had evolved into a deadly, high-stakes duel between the Atlantic and the propeller steamer Ogdensburg, a vessel belonging to a rival company. In the brutal, unforgiving corporate culture of the mid-19th century, ships were treated not as mere vessels of transport, but as extensions of their owners' power and pride. The two captains had become locked in a lethal maritime version of a chicken game. On board the Ogdensburg, which was steaming from Cleveland toward Ogdensburg, New York, with a heavy load of wheat, First Mate DeGrasse McNeil was on duty, tasked with navigating the precarious darkness. Through the shifting haze, he spotted the looming lights of the Atlantic rapidly approaching. To any seasoned mariner, the sight of an oncoming steamer required immediate, clear, and disciplined action to ensure safe passage. However, in this atmosphere of corporate enmity, standard protocols of the sea seemed to buckle and fail under the crushing weight of professional rivalry. McNeil, observing the Atlantic's trajectory, remained stubbornly convinced that the Ogdensburg would pass at least half a mile ahead of the oncoming behemoth. He had, however, fundamentally misread the intent or perhaps the blinding arrogance of the Atlantic's bridge. In a move that defied both logic and the fundamental tenets of maritime safety, the Atlantic suddenly shifted her course, turning aggressively to the north, as if intent on crossing directly in front of the Ogdensburg's path. Realizing too late that a catastrophic collision was unfolding, McNeil frantically ordered the Ogdensburg's engines into full reverse, and steered the ship hard to port in a desperate bid to avoid the unthinkable. But here, fate dealt a cruel, final hand. The Ogdensburg's steam whistle was completely broken, with the silence of the night now acting as an accessory to the impending slaughter. McNeil ran out onto the open deck, his lungs burning as he screamed toward the approaching lights, waving his arms in a vain, frantic attempt to signal the Atlantic to turn to starboard. His voice, however, was swallowed by the vast, uncaring, and indifferent expanse of Lake Erie. The reaction was far too slow, and the proximity was lethal. The ironclad bow of the Ogdensburg slammed into the Atlantic's port side, just forward of her massive, churning paddle wheel. The impact was cataclysmic, a thunderous explosion of splintering wood and shearing iron. The iron bow of the Ogdensburg tore through the Atlantic's wooden hull like a cleaver through flesh, slicing deep to the waterline. For a few agonizing, suspended seconds, the two ships remained locked in a metallic embrace, the Atlantic shuddering violently under the force of the intrusion. Then, the Ogdensburg reversed her engines, pulling away and leaving behind a gaping, ragged, and lethal wound in the Atlantic's side. The cold, dark, and unforgiving waters of the lake began to rush in with unstoppable force. As the water surged into the Atlantic, the engine room, the heart of the prideful, record-breaking Steam R, was quickly flooded, extinguishing the boilers and leaving the ship dead in the water, trapped in the freezing darkness. On deck, the chaos was absolute. Many passengers, asleep in their cabins or huddled on deck after a long day of travel, were jolted awake by the thunderous crash and the violent, sudden lurch of the vessel. Yet, the crew of the Atlantic, instead of organizing an orderly evacuation or reassuring the terrified immigrants, seemed to prioritize the ship's stability or perhaps their own survival over the lives of those they were sworn to protect. According to the harrowing, gut-wrenching accounts of survivors like Amund Eadsmo, the response of the Atlantic's crew was marked by a cold, dehumanizing lack of empathy. When the immigrants, many of whom spoke no English and could not understand the panicked, incomprehensible orders being shouted at them, rushed toward the upper deck, they were met not with guidance, but with cold, violent resistance. In a desperate, frenzied attempt to keep the ship from capsizing too quickly, the crew reportedly went as far as to pull up the stairways and ladders from the lower decks, turning them into impassable barriers that left panicked, bewildered families tumbling backward, trapped as the freezing water rose beneath them. When this failed to clear the decks, reports indicate that crew members resorted to violence, striking passengers with whatever they had in their hands, lanterns, ropes, or their own boots to force them away from the exits. The desperation of the crew could only be matched by the blind, instinctual terror of the immigrants. The efforts to launch the Atlantic's 3 lifeboats were marked by incompetence and hysteria. One boat capsized during a rushed, uncoordinated launch, throwing those inside into the lake before they had a chance to breathe or pray. In the mayhem, Captain J. Byron Petty, whose drive to maintain his schedule likely set this chain of events in motion, suffered a severe concussion while trying to manage the boats, rendering him unable to offer even the most basic orders or assistance. The remaining 2 boats, when finally launched, were reportedly filled only with crew members, leaving hundreds of immigrants, men, women, and children to face the surging waters entirely on their own. As the SS Atlantic began her final, agonizing transition from a floating palace of Gilded Age ambition into a sunken tomb of industrial failure, the chaos on deck transcended ordinary panic, reaching a crescendo of primal, instinctual human despair. The ship was listing at a steep, impossible angle, Her bow, weighed down by the torrent of rushing water and the massive, jumbled piles of immigrants' baggage, was being dragged into the abyss, while her stern remained suspended in a spectral, precarious balance buoyed only by pockets of air trapped within the cabin structure, creating a ghastly, vertical monument to the catastrophe. Amidst this scene of mechanical and human failure, the plight of individual souls began to paint a heartbreaking, intimate portrait of the disaster, one that standard reports rarely capture. Many of the first-class passengers who had been sleeping soundly in their opulent staterooms when the Ogdensburg struck found themselves trapped behind locked doors as the water surged into the narrow corridors, turning the luxury cabins they had paid so handsomely for into individual, claustrophobic, drowning chambers. Others, particularly the steerage passengers, emerged into the cold night air wearing only their nightshirts, their worldly possessions, the very things they had traveled thousands of miles across the ocean to preserve, left behind in the rapidly flooding hold. They stood on the exposed deck, shivering and helpless, their eyes searching the black, featureless horizon for a salvation that seemed increasingly unlikely in the face of such overwhelming destruction. Yet, in the midst of this overwhelming darkness, small, haunting miracles of human resilience began to manifest, offering a stark contrast to the systemic failure around them. Amund Eidsmo provides one of the most vivid, visceral accounts of survival against all statistical odds. As the Atlantic heaved and groaned, finally succumbing to the crushing weight of the water, Amund, his wife, and their 2 children were swept overboard into the churning void. In the icy, swirling current, Amund was forced to perform the impossible. He swam through the churning wreckage, his wife and children clutching desperately onto his back as the Atlantic vanished beneath the surface. It was a struggle of pure, parental defiance against the lake itself, an intimate act of love in a night defined by cold indifference. Just as hope began to fade and the cold began to numb their senses, a faint, rhythmic light appeared in the distance. What the survivors initially mistook for the comforting glow of a lighthouse beacon was, in fact, the Ogdensburg, the very vessel that had caused their ruin. The decision of the Ogdensburg to return to the scene was not immediately clear-cut. After the collision, she had reversed and backed away, initially intending to continue its voyage as if nothing had happened. However, once the crew stopped to assess the damage to their own hull, the silence of the night was pierced by the unmistakable, high-pitched cries of hundreds of people struggling in the freezing water. Captain Richardson, along with his crew, realized the true, haunting horror of what had occurred behind them. Driven by a sudden, intense surge of conscience, they finally turned the Ogdensburg back. It took nearly 10 minutes to return to the exact spot where the Atlantic had gone down, but for those clinging to the floating debris, it was a lifetime of agony. The scene that awaited the Ogdensburg was one of utter, haunting despair. The water was strewn with the remnants of hundreds of lives, trunks, wagons, shattered timber, and the desperate, clutching hands of the survivors. The Ogdensburg's crew worked with frantic, newfound efficiency, pulling survivors from the debris and plucking others who were floating aimlessly in the water. One of the most haunting vignettes of that night involved a young boy, barely 8 years old, clinging to a rope attached to a floating mast and the remnants of the Atlantic's wreck. He was heard whispering to himself, "Oh, I can't hold on much longer. If Papa was here, he would hold me up." The boy was eventually spotted by a fellow passenger, a man from Illinois, who moved along the rope and held the child up until the Ogdensburg's boat arrived to save him. The ship's clerk, Mr. Jeevan, and the first engineer, Mr. Buell, were among the last to be pulled from the water. Found clinging to the same rope, their strength nearly spent, their bodies numbed by the merciless temperature of the lake, While official records of the era were notoriously incomplete, and many passenger lists were lost when the Atlantic sank, the death toll remains a matter of grim, unresolved debate. Most conservative estimates place the loss of life at approximately 150. But as the days passed and the reality of the missing became painfully clear, the numbers climbed steadily toward 250 and even 300. Among these lost souls were approximately 68 Norwegian immigrants. Their dreams of a new life in the Midwest, ending in the depths of Lake Erie, just days after they had reached the land they believed would offer them freedom. This disaster became the fifth worst in the history of the Great Lakes in terms of lives lost on a single vessel, a grim statistic that does little to capture the individual, agonizing history of the families torn apart. As the Ogdensburg steamed toward Erie, Pennsylvania, the survivors who were now crowded onto her deck looked back at the void where the Atlantic had once been. They were left with nothing. Many had only the thin, wet clothes they wore when they jumped, and all had lost the meager possessions they had carried across the Atlantic Ocean. When the Ogdensburg limped into the port of Erie, Pennsylvania, carrying survivors who were traumatized, destitute, and grieving, they refused to be silenced by the weight of their loss. In an unprecedented act of collective defiance against corporate giants, the passengers gathered at the wharf to draft a formal, blistering resolution. This document served as a searing and undeniable indictment of the professional incompetence and moral failure displayed by the Atlantic's officers on that fatal night. With the singular, notable exception of the ship's clerk, Mr. Given, who had maintained some semblance of order during the collapse, the survivors condemned the crew's cowardice in no uncertain terms. They specifically called out the abysmal, defective quality of the life preservers that had failed so many in their hour of need, transforming what should have been safety equipment into anchors of death. In a poignant moment of gratitude, amidst the collective fury, they commended the captain of the Ogdensburg for his eventual decision to return to the scene, a gesture that highlighted the stark, painful contrast between the heartless nature of corporate duty and the simple, desperate necessity of individual human compassion. This initial act of resistance from the survivors served as the first fracture in the impenetrable facade of invincibility maintained by the powerful shipping magnates of the era, yet it was merely the opening salvo in a long, complex, and draining legal war. The battle to determine the definitive cause of the wreck eventually climbed the rungs of the American judicial system, a climb that landed the case squarely in the lap of the United States Supreme Court. The ensuing legal inquiry was a dark, convoluted labyrinth of conflicting testimonies, shifting blame, and aggressive corporate finger-pointing. When the Supreme Court finally handed down its ruling in 1856, the justices determined that both ships were equally to blame for the carnage. This landmark decision crystallized a chilling truth. The disaster was not an act of God, nor was it a freak occurrence of nature, but the entirely inevitable consequence of a bitter enmity and unchecked rivalry between two competing companies. It confirmed what the public had long suspected, that the captains, blinded by professional arrogance and the relentless, suffocating pressure to maintain a record-breaking schedule, had engaged in a lethal maneuver that prioritized ego and corporate dominance over the fundamental, time-honored rules of maritime navigation. For years leading up to this catastrophe, the federal government's silence was deafening, reflecting a systemic indifference toward maritime safety that permeated the industrial expansion of the mid-19th century. Historically, government intervention in maritime regulation was reactive rather than proactive. A grim, recurring pattern defined the legislative efforts of the American government. The Atlantic disaster served as a stark catalyst for long overdue change. Less than 2 weeks after the sinking, the U.S. Congress passed a landmark bill mandating the licensing and rigorous inspection of all passenger steamboats. These new safety regulations required every passenger vessel to carry a sufficient number of lifeboats, reliable and tested life preservers, and essential emergency aids. It was a legislative victory bought at the horrific cost of 300 lives, a testament to the harsh reality that in the industrial age, safety standards were often written in the blood of the most vulnerable. The sinking of the Atlantic was not an isolated incident. Rather, it was a pivotal part of a larger, tragic epidemic of maritime negligence that defined the era. When one compares this sinking to contemporaneous disasters, such as the frequent, violent boiler explosions on the Mississippi River, it becomes undeniably clear that the Atlantic was merely a symptom of a systemic, deep-seated rot. The unbridled quest for speed had fostered a toxic culture of technological hubris, where the engineering marvels of the day were pushed to their absolute breaking points, and the lives of the passengers were treated as a secondary, negotiable variable in a profit-driven equation. Yet, even as the legal and political dust settled, the Atlantic refused to fade into the obscurity of history. She remained a siren call for those obsessed with the secrets of the deep. Resting nearly 150 feet below the surface near Long Point, the wreck became an enduring magnet for treasure hunters, drawn by persistent rumors of the $36,700 in gold and currency, known to be in the ship's safe, a staggering fortune in 1852, when a decent daily wage was barely $1. That fall, diver John Green was hired by American Express to retrieve the safe, but his initial, frantic attempts were thwarted by the brutal, crushing conditions of the lake floor. In 1855, Green returned with the schooner Yorktown and successfully located the safe, dragging it out to the Atlantic's deck. However, a near-fatal case of the bends forced him to the hospital, and by the time he recovered in the summer of 1856, he found that another diver, Elliot Harrington, had beat him to the prize and hauled the safe to the surface. The legal aftermath of this underwater gold rush was as messy and litigious as the wreck itself. American Express sued for the recovery, and a settlement eventually saw Harrington and his crew receive a small fraction of the value, with the company taking the lion's share of the spoils. The wreck remained a ghost of history until 1984, when diver Michael Lynn Fletcher rediscovered the site. By then, the Atlantic had undergone a radical natural transformation. The thick aquatic plants that had once covered her decks had been largely stripped away by the invasive zebra mussels that had colonized the Great Lakes. The rediscovery reignited a new kind of battle, this time a geopolitical one. In 1991, a California-based salvage company, Maritime, announced their intention to exploit the wreck, paying the state of Ohio $14,000 to reform the defunct Western Wrecking Company. But the Atlantic rested firmly within Canadian waters, and the government of Ontario moved decisively to stop the desecration of the site. A divisional court ruled that the Atlantic was an artifact of Ontario's heritage, not a commodity for salvage. Today, the wreck is protected by a sophisticated electronic monitoring system that alerts the Ontario Provincial Police if any vessel lingers too long above the coordinates, a final, silent guardian for the 300 souls who still rest in her wooden hull. As we look back at the Atlantic from our modern perspective, we are forced to confront an uncomfortable, enduring question. Have we truly learned the lessons of 1852? Today, we live in an era of unprecedented technological speed and interconnected global travel, where the pursuit of efficiency and profit remains the primary driving force of our world. We have digitized the risks, but the fundamental nature of the conflict, the tension between human life and corporate interest, remains the same. If the maritime industry of the 19th century was willing to sacrifice hundreds of innocent lives for the sake of a 16-hour crossing, are we not, in our modern world, constantly making similar cold-hearted calculations? Every time we prioritize cost-cutting over rigorous safety standards or speed over human well-being, we invite our own version of the Atlantic disaster. The Jewel of the Great Lakes was not just a victim of a collision. She was a victim of an ideology that viewed humanity as a replaceable component in the machine of progress. As we navigate the complex, often treacherous currents of the 21st century, the story of the Atlantic serves as a haunting, eternal reminder that no amount of industrial prowess or technological speed can ever replace the inherent infinite value of a single human life. The Atlantic rests on the bottom of Lake Erie, a silent, rusting monument to the fact that when we abandon our empathy in favor of our unchecked ambition, we do not just risk disaster, we invite it. The question is no longer about what happened on that night in 1852, but whether we, in our modern age, possess the moral courage to stop repeating the same cold, calculated mistakes that turned a dream of a new world into a nightmare in the dark. We are the stewards of history, and the Atlantic is our witness, a silent, sunken warning that the true cost of progress is only ever paid when we forget those who paid for it with their lives. Finally, before we conclude today's message, thank you for staying with me until the very end to revisit the tragic fate of the SS Atlantic. If this story of shattered ambitions and profound loss has touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel to join our crew for our upcoming deep dives into history. What are your thoughts on today's tragedy? Please leave them in the comments below so we can connect and reflect together. Let us take a moment to honor the 300 souls who were lost forever in the icy depths of Lake Erie. On the 20th of August, 1852, their dreams cut short before they could ever be realized. Their sacrifice remains an eternal, sobering warning. I look forward to seeing you all in our next video.